Today, let's walk through some tips and tricks for sewing with sequin fabric. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and today we are talking about sewing with sequin material. Specifically, I am going to be talking about sequin material where the sequins have been sewn onto the fabric. So as you can see here, there's actually little marks that shows where these sequins have been sewn onto this fabric, and this is the fabric that we're going to be focusing on today. So I did a video a while ago where I had actually used this adhesive sequin material. This is a completely different type of fabric. I'll include a link in case you're interested in working with that. Today though, we are talking about sew-on sequin fabric. And this fabric's actually a lot easier to work with. It can range a little bit more on the pricier side just because of how these are sewn on, but it's a lot easier to work with in my opinion than that adhesive sequin material. Now this fabric can be both stretchy and not stretchy. It really depends on the version that you have, so be sure you test that out. In addition, the size of the sequins can vary, so you can have bigger sequins or smaller sequins. The smaller the size of the sequins, the easier it's going to be to work with, because as you could imagine, when we fold over this fabric and take a seam, then fold it back out, if the larger the sequin is going to make that seam a little bit more bulky, and you just have to do a little more work with it, such as removing the sequins from your seam allowance ahead of time. Now, as far as working with this fabric in particular, a few items to keep in mind. Now, when it comes to using something like pins or quilting clips are going to be the way to go. They are a little easier to work with, especially if you're working with bigger sequins. Quilting clips are going to allow you to hold that in place. If you pin through one of these sequins, it's going to leave a mark similar to how if you'd pin through vinyl, that would leave a mark. So I highly recommend using quilting clips instead of pins. Also, if you are working with those bigger sequins, be sure you remove them from your seam allowance, or else you're going to have to go back through at the end and sort of remove some of those sequins. For fabric that has smaller sequins, you can sometimes get away with it being in your seam allowance still. That's really just a matter of personal preference. Some people will feel very strongly that you should always remove the sequins from the seam allowance, but it's really up to you. In addition, just one item to note is you do not want to iron this fabric. The sequins will melt, but you will need to press it, so like finger pressing or using a rolling pin. As far as your equipment, such as scissors, you probably want to use like duller or older scissors for this, just because the sequins will dull out your fabric shears over time. And in addition, probably want to stay away from the serger unless you are opting to replace the needles and the blade. Now for your sewing machine, I've been very fortunate with all of my sequin material to be able to use a universal needle, one that's on the thicker size, maybe around like a 90-14, but you can definitely test that out and play around with your fabric to see which needle works best for you. I have also seen some people talk about that like a denim needle or a leather needle will work really well too for allowing you to get into the fabric. And then for this like larger sequin, this was a lot harder to sew, and I did use a thicker needle for that, so really up the size. Now, as far as the actual sewing is concerned, because sequin fabric is very interesting. On the inside, it can be a little scratchy, so highly recommend whenever you're sewing with it to add a lining. Also, top stitching doesn't work the best on sequin material, so you're probably going to want to do some hand slip stitching if you are adding like a hem anywhere onto your sequin projects. Now going over to our sewing machine, so I found that the same rule applies that if you're working with a stretchier sequin material, you're going to want to use a stretch stitch. If you're working with a non-stretch, you can just go with that straight stitch. If you have any difficulty with the presser foot, you could definitely look into a walking foot. I had no issues with my regular presser foot though for either of the sequin fabrics I worked with. Now as you can see here, I am actually sewing with that gold fabric, and I'm going to let you hear what this sounded like because it was very loud. And that's mostly just so that you can see that different fabrics are going to sound different on your machine, so don't be too alarmed if you start to notice a different sound. Now, one item that I did make was this gold sequin skirt, and I can highly recommend that when you're looking for patterns to use with sequin fabrics, find patterns with smaller number of seams. That way you can't really notice the seams as much, and it's a little easier to sew. Now for the fabric that had those smaller sequins, this was 10 times easier to work through, both like for one layer or two layers. And with how those smaller sequins work, it looks a lot better at the seams as well. So I hope that this video gave you a little insight into how to sew with sequin fabric. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'll have more videos coming out soon with all of the items I'm making with the sequin material. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe.